In our final lecture of Module 2, we are going to be calculating total surplus. And so we've spent some time talking about consumer surplus and producer surplus. What we're going to do is start to talk about these a little bit more in depth. So exactly how do we calculate consumer and producer surplus both at the individual level and at the market level? And then how do we determine total surplus for the market? All right, so what we're going to do is just continue building off that equilibrium that we've already determined. So we're looking at the intersection of our supply and demand curve, that point at which the quantity supplied is exactly equal to the quantity demanded. All right, so as we have previously kind of just started to discuss, consumer surplus is the extra benefit, the extra happiness we get as consumers by purchasing something at a price lower than the price we're willing to pay. So the way we calculate this is the difference between the willingness to pay for the good and the price that we actually pay from getting it. And we can think about the price that we're actually going to pay as the equilibrium price. So equilibrium price and equilibrium quantity are going to play very important roles as we're calculating our market surpluses. Okay, again, consumers like low prices, and so the lower the price, the more consumer surplus that will occur in the market. All right, and again, we're going to measure this at both the individual level and at the market level. So we're going to use both pieces to determine that surplus. All right, so in terms of that consumer surplus, let's go back to that iPhone 7 example and think about, again, what was your willingness to pay for the iPhone 7? And then compare that to that $200 price that I gave you. And so again, some of you might not even be in the market. Some of you might say, I wouldn't even purchase this for $200. But let's say that you had that willingness to pay $500, which I think for John. John was willing to pay $500 for this iPhone. So how do we determine his consumer surplus? Well, he was willing to pay $500 and he only had to pay $200. And so to determine how much extra happiness did he get? Well, I could have charged him $500 and he still would have bought the phone. So he has $300 of consumer surplus. Consumer surplus is that willingness to pay minus the price. Okay, so this is consumer surplus on an individual level. We're calculating it just for one single individual. All right, so that's what we're thinking about in terms of consumer surplus, looking at the willingness to pay minus the price. So when we're moving on to the market consumer surplus, what we have to think about is the demand curve. Our demand curve represents the willingness and ability of all consumers in the market to purchase the product. And so that's going to become very important. We're going to think about our demand curve and our equilibrium price when we're thinking about the willingness to pay of our consumers and the price. All right, again, so that demand curve represents the willingness to pay of all consumers in the market. And so we're going to look at that demand curve, and that's going to be our upper end portion. That's like the $500 for John. That's going to be the willingness to pay of all consumers in the market. So comparing the demand curve to the equilibrium price will help us determine the consumer surplus in the market. So let's look at this graphically, what I mean. Okay, so here we have just a simple supply and demand. We can see an equilibrium price of P1 and an equilibrium quantity of Q1. It's just where the intersection of our supply and our demand curve. And so we're going to compare that P1 to our demand curve. Remember that green line, that demand curve represents the willingness and ability of consumers to pay. And so let me just bring up a pen here so I can talk about it. So we can imagine that these consumers right here, that's not a straight line. Sorry, my pad wasn't straight. But all of these consumers to the left of the equilibrium are purchasing the product. And so all of them are gaining consumer surplus. And so if we look at this individual, and maybe he's the fifth individual in the market, he has a willingness to pay of this level right there, and he actually pays that price of P1, And so what we see then is each of this green shaded area is going to represent the consumer surplus in the market. All right, so when calculating consumer surplus, what we need to know is going to be the PD. Where does the demand curve intersect with that vertical price axis? So that's going to be the highest, the consumer and the market who's willing to pay the most is PD. That's how much that individual is willing to pay. P1 is our equilibrium price, and Q1 is our equilibrium quantity. So what we're doing then is calculating the area of that triangle, PD to P1 to Q1. And so if that were that rectangle or square, it looks kind of like a square in this case, but what we would see is it would be base times height. But since it's a triangle, we multiply that by half. So 1/2 of the height of our triangle is PD minus P1. That represents the height. And then the base of that triangle, it goes from Q1 to 0. So we just have to multiply it by Q1. So Q1 represents that base. PD to P1 represents the height, and we multiply it by 1. Well, the most important takeaway that I want you to know here is that we're using that demand curve, the distance between below the demand curve, above the equilibrium price, from 0 to our equilibrium quantity, represents the consumer surplus. Let me say that one more time because it's very important. The area below our demand curve, above the equilibrium price, from 0 to our equilibrium quantity, represents consumer surplus. These are all the consumers in the market that are purchasing the product and the amount of happiness, extra happiness they get from a price of P1. We could change our price, and that as a result will change consumer surplus. But remember, we're just looking at the area below the demand curve, above the equilibrium price. Since we're calculating consumer surplus, we care about the demand curve. Forget about the supply curve at this point. All right, when we move on to producer surplus, this is where we care about our supply curve because producers determine that supply curve. All right, so producer surplus, very similar to consumer surplus, except remember, producers or sellers of the product like high prices. So the higher the price, the more producer surplus an individual producer will get. So the producer surplus is defined as the difference between the price the producer receives and their willingness to produce. Okay, so the difference between that equilibrium price that we're going to find and the willingness of each producer to produce, and that's going to be represented by that supply curve when we start to look at the market. Again, we're going to look at it at the individual level and then at the market level. So you can look at it just the way we have with consumers and the iPhones. That would be the individual level. And then the market level is when we start to expand and look at all of the individual producers in the market together, and that's going to be on that supply and demand graph. All right, so going back to that example that we did in class where I asked you what was your willingness to supply, how much would you want to be paid per hour to babysit my kids? And so what if I told you I would pay you $15 an hour? How does that compare? And so again, some of you might not be in the market. That's not important. But I think Billy was willing to babysit for $10 an hour. I was willing to pay him $15, but he was going to do it for $10. Right? And so his willingness to supply is $10 an hour. He's extra happy because he gets paid $15. He likes to get paid more, right? When he's producing a product, he wants to be paid the most possible. And so since I'm paying $15, we're imagining that's like the equilibrium price. Okay, so he's receiving $15. He would have done it for $10. So to determine his producer surplus, we're going to take that $15 and subtract out the $10 that he was willing to supply his labor at. And what we see is his producer surplus is $5 an hour. So he's producing this product and receiving extra happiness, extra benefits in terms of $5 for each hour. and that's our producer surplus. And again, this is how you're going to calculate it at the individual level. So make sure you write down those equations in red. Consumer surplus is slightly different because remember, it's willingness to sell, or sorry, willingness to buy minus price, whereas producer surplus, since they like high prices, it's price minus willingness to sell. Okay, again, what you should never see are negative consumer surpluses or negative producer surpluses, because if they're negative, that means those individuals are not in the market, because they would never want to willingly bring about unhappiness. Remember, producer and consumer surpluses are the benefits, and if they're not receiving a benefit, then they're not going to do it. All right, so let's look at it graphically, and it's going to be the same idea. We take price, and remember our price is that equilibrium price of P1, and we compare that to the willingness to sell. Willingness to sell is represented by the supply curve. So what we care about now is the distance, that area between below the price, above the supply curve from 0 to the quantity. And again, what we can find are that each seller that's actually selling, we could measure their individual just the same way that we just calculated it, but it's represented by all of these different areas. This is the seller's willingness to sell at this, for this, let's say it's the fourth seller. And here is what they actually receive. And so we know that this blue area here represents any extra happiness for all producers in the market. And when we calculate that, then it's going to be this blue square area. All right, so again, how do we calculate the blue square area? We need to know the PS, and this is the price, the lowest price that the first seller is willing to accept. And then we need P1, we need the equilibrium price, and we need the equilibrium quantity. And again, it's going to be the area of a triangle, so we want to look at our height. And again, our height is from PS to P1. So we're going to take 1, and again, it's a triangle, so we have to divide it by 1/2. So P1 minus PS represents the height of that triangle. The base, again, is from 0 to Q1, so we just have to multiply it by Q1, and we multiply it by 1/2 to get rid of base times height would be a square or a rectangle. You have to multiply it by 1/2 to get into a triangle. All right, so this is going to represent our producer surplus. Again, the distance below the equilibrium price and above the supply curve. The distance below the equilibrium price and above the supply curve from 0 to our equilibrium quantity. All right, and now that we've understood our producer and our consumer surplus, we can bring those together to determine our total surplus. Our total surplus in the market is just that consumer surplus plus our producer surplus. So if we've already calculated that, we can calculate it. If we've already calculated each one separately, we can just leave it at that. We can take that consumer surplus we've calculated, add it to the producer surplus, and that will give us total surplus. Otherwise, if we have to calculate it just from this information, we would need to know PD, we'd need to know PS, and we'd have to know Q1. And what we would use for an equation for total surplus would be that 1/2, because again, we have a triangle shape over here. It's a triangle, and since it's a triangle, we have to immediately multiply by 1/2. And then we know then that the height of our triangle is going to be the difference between PD. Some of you might argue that that's the base, and I probably would too, but to PS. So we take PD minus PS, and again we go from 0 to our quantity, and since 0 is 0, we don't have to subtract it out, but we can then look at the height of our triangle, or the base, however you want to say it, from 0 to Q1. So that's going to give us our total surplus. You can either calculate consumer surplus, calculate producer surplus, and add them together, or 1/2 the price, the PD number, where our demand curve intersects with that price axis, minus price supplied, so PS, and that's where the supply curve intersects with that axis, and then multiply that by their equilibrium quantity. So what you see is when you calculate total surplus as a whole, you don't need to know that equilibrium price. It doesn't matter. Okay, what becomes important is that individual demand and individual supply curve. And then Q1, we do need to know our equilibrium quantity. And I might even have wrote all that down. All right, but so it's very similar to what I just wrote down. But again, you can just use that if you've had to already calculate consumer and producer surplus, add those two together to get your total surplus. Total surplus measures any benefits to society as a whole from this market interaction. Okay, so not only do we have consumers that are happy, producers are also happy. We're matching those consumers and producers together, and there's extra benefits to society. All right, so now that we've gone through these market, consumer, and producer and total surplus examples, let's look at an actual example with real numbers. Real numbers determining those producer and consumer surpluses along with total surplus. So if you'd like, you can first pause this and then from there go on and look at the answers, or if you just like to work them out at the same time as me, either way, I'm more than happy to work it out for you. All right, so let's start with consumer surplus. So pause if you'd like, otherwise we're gonna work this out. Remember, what we need to know is that PD number, the P1 number, and the and Q1. All right, so first let's determine what's the equilibrium. And the equilibrium is right here, the intersection of the supply and the demand curve. And so our P1 is going to be 30, and our Q1 is 100. The PD is the intersection of our demand curve with that price axis, and that is 60. And so what we have here, our consumer surplus is the difference between our demand curve and our price from 0 to the equilibrium quantity. So right here is our consumer surplus. So how do we calculate consumer surplus? Well, we're going to take the difference. We're going to look at the height of this triangle. And the height of this triangle is the difference between PD and P1. So 60 minus 30. Multiply it by Q1 because we're going from 0 to Q1. And so that's 100. And since it's a triangle, we have to multiply it by 1/2. So what we have here is 30 times 100 times 1/2. So we can do 30 times 50. Oop, I hit a box here. Get that out of the way. And that to me looks like there, 1,500. All right, from there we can then calculate and our consumer surplus, producer surplus, it's going to be a dollar amount, just the same way that John got consumer surplus of $300 at the market level. We're also going to have that in terms of dollar amounts. All right, producer surplus, we needed P1 and Q1 as well, but instead of PD, we need PS. And PS represented that area where our supply curve intersected the price axis, and that happens at $0 in this example. And so what we see is the price minus PS times 0, or from 0 to the quantity of 100. So this is the 30 minus 0, the difference between the price and the willingness to supply for all 100 producers of the product is going to be our PS. And since we have a triangle, we must multiply this by 1/2. And actually what we see in this example is, again, we can do 30 times, and then let's take that 100 times 1/2 to get 50 again, and 1,500 again. It's not always going to be the case that producer and consumer surplus are equal. In this case, they are. And we have 1,500. So for total surplus, we can either add those two numbers together, or for total surplus, remember we need PD, we need PS, we can ignore our equilibrium price, and we need Q1. And so it's going to equal the difference between PD, so 60, minus the PS, which is 0, times 100, times, and we still have a triangle, because now remember we're measuring this whole area from 0 to the highest willingness to pay for a buyer, from 0 to the equilibrium quantity, both consumer and producer surplus. And what we see when we do that is going to be 3,000. So 60 times 50. All right, and that represents our total surplus, $3,000. All right, so that concludes our lecture. For more examples on total surplus, producer surplus, and consumer surplus, make sure you check out the worksheet and the practice problems for this module. Good luck on the quiz.